at the nearby brine springs to produce salt. Occupation and salt processing continued into the late Chalcolithic to around 4500 to 4200 BC, which is when the whole region saw systemic decline. This site was part of the Chalcolithic trade networks that exchanged gold and copper from the Balkan Mountains, spondylus and other shells from the Aegean, and other resources like obsidian, all as raw materials and in the form of finished tools and ornaments. Just 40 kilometers away from Sonitsata was the famous Varna Cemetery, the site with the oldest gold treasure in the world, the burial site of the world's first elite metalworkers and chiefs, buried with an abundance of metal weapons and ornaments. The settlement here at Sonitsata was protected by fortifications like a defensive ditch or moat, stone walls, stone bastions, and wooden palisades. It's these encircling defences and the economic and trade specialisation that leads some to conceive of the site as a kind of proto-urban settlement or town. There's also evidence for ritual activity taking place here and nearby, and a Vinca culture-style model mask has been discovered. Excavations are carried out for 2 months every summer, and there's still an enormous amount to be uncovered. You read about places like this, and you can't help but imagine what life would have been like for those living here over 6,000 years ago. The population was probably only a few hundred people at any one time. Their work would have included collecting and transporting the brine, cutting timber for the fires, collecting clay for the...
There are a lot of great-looking towns and settlements in history. It's sad that a lot of them don't exist anymore. Definitely, I was thinking... Europe is kind of famous for having, all these old structures that, still exist from ages ago. Obviously, we're looking at one right now. We're considered to be one of the oldest towns in human history, basically. I was just thinking about how similar that whole meme about how, like in America, 100-year-old like tavern is considered antique and like ancient, whereas like in Europe, they're like, oh yeah, that pub down the street, like 1,000 years old, and that's normal for them. But I don't know. I was thinking about the contrast there, but yeah.
The ovens, and for making the evaporation jars. They would have made bags and baskets for transporting the salt cakes, and built and crewed boats for paddling their produce along the river.
Salt cake sounds. On one hand, it sounds almost like a very niche like meal. But then also there's also like uranium cake, isn't there? So I don't know, kind of. I'm sure back in the day these salt cakes were as valuable as uranium cake. But yeah, interesting connotations there.
For trade with neighbours like the metallurgic masters of Varna. You wonder what their spiritual beliefs were like, what they thought about the nature of this special substance that emerged from the earth, surely like a gift from the gods of the underworld.
That's an interesting way of phrasing it. We can imagine, this is that kind of idea is like how to phrase it, certain religious spiritual practices develop, whereas people find these incredibly complex and involved rituals. You can get these sort of these gifts from the earth, which for a lot of people would have been seen as kind of like the giver of life kind of thing. So and it's very. I love hearing how, because I've heard this before in similar settings where the ancient sort of origins of spirituality and religion were these very kind of I guess what us moderners would consider very profane sources of production of commodities and things like that, which for these people these weren't just commodities. Like salt was a literal life or death issue sort of thing, and being able to pull that out with, I mean, what must have been from their point of view, because they're basically taking water and basically extracting salt from it. I mean, I must have seen the people who don't understand how evaporation works. That could be easily interpreted as something, just inexplicable, and the inexplicable is often considered is often just a synonym for spiritual.
The other site that fires my imagination is over 1,000 kilometers away.
Look no further than how people treat freaking AI chatbots. They do not understand those things at all, and thus the AI psychosis sets in when they start treating it like a little god on earth. But this is not about that. This video is not about that kind of stuff.
Way to the northwest, and dates to the Bronze Age, the salt mines of Hallstatt. There's a surprising amount of research on prehistoric salt once you start looking. The best single overview is the book by Anthony Harding. There's another popular book called Salt: A World History by Mark Kolansky, which is a pretty fun read, and there's many academic publications about specific sites or regions. As always, I'll leave some key sources in the description below. In the Bronze Age in Europe, most salt was obtained through salt springs and by processing seawater in coastal regions. I'll talk more about that later, but both methods used briquettage to evaporate the brine by heating. Some places though also mined halite, rock salt, directly. Probably there were places quarrying exposed halite where it was accessible at the surface. Most places that did that have continued being quarried, and so all ancient workings have long since been obliterated. But there are a few hints here and there still surviving, like from Transylvania and Ukraine, where wooden troughs with holes in the bottom have been discovered and were used somehow in salt.
If you took someone like from this age and put them in the modern world, how do you think they would react? Well, I mean, they did. The people back then, they did have personalities, right? So it would depend. It would really depend on their background and their demeanor. But I imagine plenty of people would be surprisingly able to adapt. I mean, because from their point of view, it's just another culture. Really, it's not like the human mind is only capable of is only compatible with a certain level of technology based on some artificial imagined bounds. Whatever, they. I mean, yeah, obviously older people are gonna have a harder time adapting to different things. But I think you get like a 20-year-old, whatever. They could probably, as long as they learn the language and give them a little rundown on how to use a phone, perhaps. They could probably be pretty. At least in terms of their ability to use technology, they're probably pretty indistinguishable from most people. It would really be the like culture shock that would probably be the most noticeable from both ends. They would definitely have very different ideas about what's normal and like unacceptable and stuff like that. And that would be interesting. That'd be because I've something I've done research. I've tried to do research, but it can be kind of difficult to really wrap your head around. Just how different people from different kind of like, I guess, eras are in terms of their culture. I mean, I remember watching a video about like the medieval period, where like in that time and place, a lot of things we take for granted socially, just were not a thing. Like for us, things are generally speaking way more informal. Like our language does not have a lot of built-in markers of status. We have things like Mr. and Mrs. and Doctor this and that, but like we don't have like incredibly intricate sort of linguistic markers of person's status, because like things like Duke or Earl, whatever, those weren't just, I mean, for us, we just kind of see them as just titles, like how Doctor or whatever is a title. But for your average, medieval person, if you did not refer to somebody by their proper title, that was serious grounds for like punishment really. Like it was no, it was a big deal. You would not play around with people's tiles. There was a much bigger, like the social hierarchy was a lot more, instantiated consciously in public life. Obviously we still do have status hierarchies as much as we try to, evolve past that. We still definitely have this sort of thing. I can look no further than how rich people get treated by the justice system versus us plebs, but it was way more just accepted as just part of everyday life for everyone. But, things like that can be hard to wrap your head around because they're ultimately just really cultural differences, and it's really difficult to simply learn about that. You gotta have to live it and be in it to really understand the contours of it. And it's even harder to do that with people like this who are from freaking BC time, where there's no, presumably no written records at all. But yeah.
Salt processing. Hollowed out tree trunks from Romania have been dated to the Bronze Age, between the 16th and the 9th centuries BC. There was industrial level processing in this region, involving clay-lined wicker tanks, some of them with roofs, to store brine. The troughs they carved might have been used to drip fresh water onto rock salt deposits below. The holes along the troughs had wooden plugs, themselves with tiny holes in that held twisted cords dangling down, dissolving sections of the exposed halite directly beneath the drips, creating weak points that could be cracked open and pried apart. This has been tested and it actually works, by the way. Another hypothesis that has been tested and found to work is that they poured brine into the troughs and let it drip out slowly, perhaps onto textiles below where salt crystals would form for collection. Proper mining, digging shafts and galleries beneath the ground, was a highly skilled and dangerous activity. Most prehistoric mine works, like copper and tin mines for example, were destroyed by later mining activities in the same area, and that probably happened to salt mines too. However, in the famous salt region of Hallstatt in Austria, some of the prehistoric mine workings survived. Most of them are from the Iron Age, when the salt mining intensified in scale, but they started deep salt mining here in the Bronze Age, as far back as 1450 BC. Wooden structures were built underground, like scaffolds, and this surviving staircase, which has been called the oldest surviving wooden staircase in the world. The timber for it was felled in 1344 BC. What's left of it is 1.8 meters wide and 8 meters long. You can tell by the angle of the treads that it was steeper in its original position, and it might have been built to let miners cross heaps of mining spoil. There are other parts of staircases found in the mines too. The high salt content of the mine's atmosphere severely restricts microbial activity, preserving organic material, including wooden tools and leather clothing.
Even thinking, what do you think some ancient versions of modern instruments look like? Well, we do have lots of, depending on which sort of classification of instrument you're talking about, like stringed instruments, those have been around since forever. I mean, obviously, I think wind instruments are kind of like the OG original instruments. Flutes made out of like bones and wood, branches, stuff like that. I mean, those have not changed at all. I mean, things like keyboard type stuff, pianos and whatnot. I mean, those are technically kind of string percussion instruments. I guess the rudiments of them are obviously percussion. And I previously mentioned strings; those have been around basically since the beginning as well. I mean, the bass elements are pretty much all musical instruments. Presumably, you're talking about musical instruments. I guess I'm assuming that. But yeah, those were pretty much all. Since you can make those all out of like animal hide for the percussion, you can use like tendons to get the strings. All those things are readily producible. So presumably they've been around for a while. Like they definitely haven't changed too much. I mean, the only real changes for like a guitar or something is like the number of instruments or the number of strings on the body and things like the shape of the body, and how big or small it is. But But I mean, the basics are the basics for a reason. They don't change much.
We don't know for sure who would have worked down here in the flickering light of these spruce and fir tapers and oil lamps, but the salt mine was of vital importance for the people that controlled it in the Urnfield period. These people are known from the thousands of Bronze Age and Iron Age burials here. The extraordinary...
Basically a prior Roman Empire almost.
abundance of graves, human remains, and material culture in the form of grave goods has provided an enormous insight into the era, the early Iron Age especially. This huge cemetery gave its name to the Proto-Celtic Hallstatt culture, which was enormously important and influential right across Europe. The Bronze Age saw the emergence of chiefly elites who would grow in power throughout the era through control of local resources, such as salt from the mines here in Hallstatt and nearby Doomburg near Hallein, and the concentration of wealth in the hands of warlords wielding bronze and then iron swords. In the Iron Age, say between around 800 BC to 100 BC, salt production reached an unprecedented scale and sophistication right across Europe. Technological advancements and population growth drove demand and supply, and increasingly complex societies required both reliable food preservation and commodities for exchange. Most of the archaeological evidence for European salt production comes from this era. There were salt production sites in Mediterranean coastal regions where sea salt could be evaporated by the power of the sun alone. But in northwestern Europe, it was too cold even in summer to do that. And this is where archaeologists and antiquarians discovered these great mounds of smashed briquetage at sites where seawater was concentrated and evaporated. In eastern England, these mounds of brick-coloured debris were called red hills. One of the highest concentrations of these ancient structures was in coastal Essex. The stretch of the River Blackwater between the town of Malden and Mersey Island has long been famous for salt production.
You have a favorite instrument? Yours was the recorder, and he's really good at. Good on you. I mean, I guess. Well, this is the difference between favorite instrument to listen to versus favorite to play. I mean, I don't really have a favorite instrument to listen to, but playing, I mean, I got really good at guitar. I mean, I got one right over in the corner of the room over there, but I haven't touched it in a while because, I mean, life just got so busy I didn't have the time for it. But yeah, maybe I guess now I get back into it now. I have the time, but anyway. Yeah, you said your recorder broke and you forgot to play it over time. I mean, if you want to, I don't know how much recorders cost, but I mean, they're normally the way that they're treated kind of like, I guess beginner instruments. Hopefully they're not that expensive, but if you want to get back into it, I would always say as long as time and energy permitting, why not?
It's home today to one of the world's premier sea salt brands, Malden Sea Salt. The salt marshes along the north banks of this tidal river, through the local currents and tides, and the repeated inundations and evaporations have accumulated a high concentration of salt. The creeks here are so salty that traditionally boys from across the area were brought here to learn to swim, benefiting from the increased buoyancy provided by the salt. And the air and soil is so rich in salt that local orchards better survive late frosts. And the sheep and cattle reared on the salt marsh are especially healthy and delicious. The salt works here continued in different forms through the Middle Ages into the modern period, shaping the character of these places and the people. There are villages and streets named after salt, and the salty creeks and salt marshes create this landscape that's not the sea, but isn't quite land either. In the Iron Age, the communities here likely produced salt seasonally and at relatively small scale. They used different methods to concentrate the salt, from digging a series of clay-lined pits to using wooden troughs, and finally boiling the brine in ceramics and creating the mounds of briquetage later antiquarians named Red Hills. There are over 300 red hills known from Essex alone. Similar sites can be found dating to the Iron Age and the Roman period of Britain right across England, usually concentrated in estuaries. As well as for local production, the resulting salt was traded inland to the population centres where demand for salt was highest. Different techniques were often used at different contemporary sites, suggesting that idiosyncratic methods were developed and passed down through families and communities, even when contemporary sites were so close they were in view of one another. These mounds of spoil, created over generations, remind me a bit of Mesolithic shell middens created by hunter-gatherers. On one level, it was just a pile of industrial waste, but on another, it was a monument to your work and to your ancestors who had stood where you stood and had done the work that you were doing and had passed on their skills and wisdom through the ages. There's some suggestion they did see the Red Hills a bit like this, with possible ritual depositions and even nearby burials relating to the Red Hills, seemingly attaching some ritual spiritual significance to these structures. Today, the Red Hills of Essex have been flattened by seawall flood defences and ploughed flat by farmers, but fragments of briquetage can still be seen on the surface at the edge of the ploughed land or in the sea wall, or eroding from the muddy banks of the salt marsh. Coastal production complemented inland mining and salt spring exploitation, meaning that from the Iron Age onwards, salt was widely available across much of prehistoric Europe. These distinctive local traditions would often continue into the Roman and later historical periods, when large-scale salt pans were established on Mediterranean and Atlantic coastlines, some of which continue to be used today. There's this phrase or idea that you see repeated sometimes, that in the ancient world, salt was more valuable than gold. I think most people
Definitely
know
heard that
that was never the case,
Oh,
and this idea
know
may
that.
have come from a misunderstanding of the trans-Saharan trade, where gold was plentiful and salt was harder to come by. But salt could have great value in prehistory, depending on the time and place, and some communities and some people would have grown wealthy and powerful from its production and trade. It's something we take for granted today, but for some of our ancestors, as far back as 8,000 years ago, as they transformed this special substance through complex processes, so salt had the power to transform their communities, helped shape their ways of life, and influence the course of European history. If you like these kinds of videos, please subscribe to my channel so you can see more videos like this in future, and your subscription really helps me out too. Thank you very much indeed to my patrons and channel members for supporting my work. Your contributions help me to obtain all this wonderful footage of ancient sites and the salt marshes of Essex. If you haven't joined yet, please do so using the links in the description below. Now, to find out more about prehistoric mining, please watch this video on the largest copper mine of the ancient world, the incredible Mines of Kargali. Thank you for watching.
Alright. Great video, interesting. I've seen this guy's stuff before, it's always really good. Yeah, before I get into some of my thoughts on the video, I'll read out Tiller Nunez's comment. But yeah, in one of your old schools, you had a music class, and you had had to do a cover for a project, and you did "I Want It My Way." And oh wait, you did a cover of "I Want It My Way" based around social distancing. That's very interesting. Definitely. I mean, as someone who's out of secondary school, and by the time the quarantine and all that happened, it is always a little interesting hearing, I guess, young people, I say that as a 28-year-old, talk about how the pandemic affected their middle and high school. I mean, for us college students, yeah, it was crazy. I mean, having to zoom into everything, but it wasn't. I mean, I don't know. For me, it didn't feel like that big of a deal, but I was one of those people, one of those super introverts who was I mean, quarantining, social distancing. That's just my normal daily life. Nothing really changed. But I don't know. Anyway, as for the video, definitely, like I said, very interesting. I definitely, it turns out they were not, the workers were not slaves as I had assumed. I guess that shows. I guess I showed my prejudice there. But anyway, I did find it interesting. I mean, he brings up later on how you can see the clay pottery sort of used in the process of making salt cakes, being broken and just tossed away in the basically trash heaps. As is that industrial waste, or is that proof of a long tradition, family heritage kind of thing? And that was definitely an interesting way to interpret it, because I mean, nowadays we would never look at a trash heap as like proof of proof of a long line of families, because it's a bit different. When our trash is not, or rather our industrial waste is not the result of a small family shop, or like in work or whatever. It's the result of a factory, generally speaking, just trying to find any way to get rid of their waste without having to spend an extra penny. It's like that whole alienation of our labor thing. It's kind of like the foundation of our current organization of the economy. So definitely an interesting thing to think about. Yep, that's our first video on this whole React journey. A little bit bumpy in the beginning, but yeah, we managed to get through it. So I guess we're moving on to our next video. Thanks so much for watching. Consider liking, commenting, maybe even subscribing. And if you're feeling particularly generous and of age in your country of residence, try visiting these links up in the corner. Anyway, here are some more videos to check out, and until next time, take care.